There is a person you passed today who smiled, answered every question, laughed at the right moments, and looked completely, unmistakably fine. And inside, quietly, they were drowning. You would never have guessed. That is the strangest thing about this particular illness. It hides in plain sight, behind ordinary faces, and most of the time, nobody notices at all. Depression is one of the leading causes of disability on the entire planet. The World Health Organization estimates that hundreds of millions of people live with it right now, across every country, every culture, every income level. In the United States alone, close to 1 in 10 adults will struggle with it. And yet, for something this common, it remains one of the most misunderstood conditions in human medicine. Part of the problem is that you cannot see it. A broken bone shows up on an X-ray. High cholesterol shows up in a blood test. But depression lives somewhere harder to reach, and that invisibility creates confusion that follows people their whole lives. Here is the confusion that trips almost everyone up. There is a difference between having depression and simply feeling depressed. Think about the last time your mood dropped. Maybe you failed something you cared about. Maybe you lost a job or had a brutal argument. Or maybe it was nothing more than a gray, rain-soaked afternoon that left you feeling heavy for no clear reason. Sometimes sadness arrives with no invitation at all. It just appears. And then, days later, the situation shifts and the feeling lifts on its own. That is normal. That is being human. Clinical depression does not work that way. This is a medical disorder, and it does not pack up and leave just because you want it to. It settles in. It stays for at least 2 solid weeks, and often far longer. And it quietly dismantles a person's ability to work, to play, to love the people right in front of them. The things that once felt easy start to feel impossible. So how do doctors actually recognize it? They look for a cluster of symptoms: a low sinking mood, a loss of interest in the things that used to bring joy, changes in appetite, a crushing sense of worthlessness or guilt, sleeping far too much or barely at all, trouble concentrating, a body that feels either restless or impossibly slow, energy that simply vanishes, and in the hardest cases, recurring thoughts of not wanting to be here anymore. When at least 5 of these show up together and refuse to leave, that is when guidelines point toward a diagnosis. But here is what almost no one realizes. This is not only about feelings or behavior. Depression leaves physical fingerprints inside the brain. Some of these changes are large enough that you could spot them on a scan. Researchers have observed smaller frontal lobes and reduced volume in the hippocampus, the region tied to memory and emotion. Zoom in closer, down to the cellular level, and it gets even more revealing. There are disruptions in key brain chemicals, especially serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. The body's internal clock gets thrown off, scrambling the deep and dreaming stages of sleep. Even hormones drift out of balance, with stress chemicals like cortisol running high. So this is not weakness, it is biology. And yet, here is the unsettling part. After all of this research, scientists still cannot tell you exactly what causes it. It seems to grow out of a tangled conversation between your genes and your environment, between what you inherited and what life handed you. There is still no single test that can predict where it will strike, or when, or in whom. Which brings us back to that person who looked perfectly fine. Because the symptoms are invisible, it is genuinely difficult to know who is silently struggling. And this is where the real tragedy hides. According to research from mental health institutions, the average person living with a mental illness waits years, sometimes more than a decade, before reaching out for help. Imagine that, 10 years of carrying something alone before saying a single word. So why wait so long? Shame, fear, the belief that they should be able to fix it themselves. But here is the hopeful turn in the story. The treatments genuinely work. Medication and therapy can act together to rebalance the chemistry of the brain and rebuild the patterns of daily life. In severe cases, carefully controlled medical procedures can offer relief when nothing else has. And newer approaches, like gentle magnetic stimulation of the brain, are showing real promise in ongoing research. So what can you actually do if someone you love is in this place? You encourage them, gently, You do not push. You might offer to handle the small things that feel like mountains to them, like finding a therapist nearby or writing down questions to bring to a doctor. To you, those tasks sound simple. To someone in the grip of depression, they can feel completely insurmountable. And if they feel ashamed, remind them of something true. Depression is a medical condition, no different from asthma or diabetes. It is not a flaw in their character. You would never tell someone to just will away a broken arm, and this deserves the same compassion. One more thing, and this matters more than people think. If you have never been through it yourself, resist the urge to compare it to a bad week you once had. Measuring their pain against ordinary sadness only teaches them to feel guilty for struggling at all. Sometimes the most powerful thing is simply talking, openly, without flinching. Research has found something that surprises almost everyone. Asking a person directly about dark thoughts does not plant the idea. It actually lowers their risk. Honest conversation chips away at the stigma, and every crack in that stigma makes it a little easier for the next person to speak. Because the more people reach out, the more we learn. And the more we learn, the better these treatments become. So the next time you pass someone who seems perfectly fine, remember, you are only ever seeing the surface. And the bravest thing a human being can do is admit out loud that they are not okay.